Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to today's EDI webinar, which marks the launch of the Architects Registration Board's report on equality, diversity and inclusion in the profession. Just a little bit by way of housekeeping, we have about an hour for today's session, and it'll be broken down into a brief introduction from panelists and then followed by a presentation on the data and the findings, and then hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. I recognise quite a few names of participants, but for those who don't know me, I'm Hugh Simpson. I'm the Chief Executive and Registrar of the Architects Registration Board, and with me on the panel is Rebecca Roberts-Hughes, who's Director of Policy and Communications, whose team have been responsible for compiling the data and will present some of the findings after introductions. But perhaps most importantly, we have Terry Okoro, who is an architect member of ARB's board. And obviously, it's the board itself has signed off the strategy and put very much centre of the strategy the importance of us doing what we can in our regulatory role in relation to equality and diversity inclusion. So by way of introduction, I'd just like to hand over to Terry, who will hopefully say a few words about the board's commitment to this topic. Terry?
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. And so, yes, I've been on the ARB board for about 2 years now, and I have been sort of assisting to champion equality, diversity and inclusion while I've been there. And so while I've been there, we've adopted this new strategy, which is on our website and something we believe in which we're moving forward. We believe that architecture should represent the communities to which they're delivering services for. We're not quite there yet. There's some way to go, but collecting the data and knowing what the landscape is like is part of the way of getting there. We feel that ARB needs to show leadership in this area, but it's not something that we can do alone. So we're looking to work with other like-minded bodies and individuals and groups in this area to help to move the dial forward, because we need a joined up approach to achieve this change. And so today is an important day for us to be able to release this data, but we know that there's still quite a bit of work ahead for us to do, and we're going to welcome, any information that comes through today, and we're always open to have discussion. We have this engagement group which is represented here today. So what we'll say is that we're really open for discussions in equality, diversity and inclusion. Today's publication is part of our journey there, but we'll just continue to do what it takes to assist us move the profession forward. And we have lots of other projects which all link in to this, reviewing education, etc. So I'll hand back to Hugh to carry on.
Thanks, Terry. And as Terry said, all of our work in this area really leads back to the corporate strategy which the board has approved. But I guess by way of a starting point, it's an acknowledgement that Terry says is that we recognise as an organisation there's a lot more that we need to do. And I think when thinking about that purposefully, what we have to do as a statutory body is to look at what are our functions, what do we do as an organisation, and really there are sort of 5 broad functions that we do. We set the standards for the initial education and training of architects, and again we'll touch within some of the discussion on the report, I'm sure, about the role of equality, diversity and inclusion and what we need to do more in that field. And that covers a range of things in terms of data collection, as well as thinking about the standards for learning providers. Those education standards are fundamental to our registration process. And again, a lot of what Rebecca will talk about today is the makeup of the register. And I think that's possibly the most powerful thing we can do in terms of being a catalyst for change, is to share what's actually happening so that the solutions are really trying to address the problems rather than anecdote or individual perceptions about what the problems may be. So I think that's really fundamental. We'll also talk a bit later about one of our other statutory functions, which is the code of conduct and standards for the profession, and how we can use those to drive some of these issues around equality, diversity, inclusion. And again, one of the other functions we have now, which is a relatively new function, which is a statutory requirement in relation to CPD. And again, we've had a couple of questions in relation to that. And I guess part of the acknowledgement is I think organisations like us and ARB itself have been weak in this area. And part of the reason that we've been weak, I think, is because it's very easy to hide behind the cloak of issues around equality, diversity, inclusion being multifactorial, being complex, and they are. But I think we're committed, and certainly the board is committed to ensuring that we don't use that as an excuse. We say, yes, it's complicated, but we have to do, and we have to identify areas where we can take action. And as Terry said, we have to involve others, both in terms of giving us ideas, but also challenging us and saying what people think we can do more of. So part of today is fulfilling the first of our commitments, really, in terms of identifying data and sharing data so that we can better understand the problems exist. And then we'll also, towards the end, talk about some of the actions we're planning to do and to get your feedback on those and to think what more we can do. So that's really just a kind of a bit of an introduction to today, and to recognise both what our commitments are, but also an acknowledgement about our role in this. So as you'll see, Rebecca's just putting some slides up, and Rebecca will talk you through some of our findings, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the actions we're taking and open it up to Q&A. So Rebecca, over to you.
Great, thank you, Hugh. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope this is going to be a useful session. Waiting for my slide to move on. Okay, so this report is going to cover two different areas of data that we've analysed together. The first is that architects must give us some information about themselves when they join the register, and that includes their date of birth, a location so that we can contact them, and historically we asked them for their binary gender, although that's something that we changed in December of last year. We've included an other category so people can tell us different gender representations if they wish to. This data is from before that period, so we're going to be talking about binary gender today. We also have an optional EDI survey, and you can see from the graph there the proportion of architects who've completed it over time, year on year. This report is based on a snapshot of the register that was taken on the 31st of July 2022, and at this point in time 76% of architects on the register have completed the survey. So getting into the figures then, gender, first of all. So might come as no surprise to some of you. And of course, some of this data is stuff that we publish quarterly anyway. This report goes into more detail, but only 31% of architects in the UK are female, which is of course significantly lower than the UK average population, which is 51%. So women are underrepresented within the profession. This graph shows two different approaches to gender. So it shows the binary approach, which I mentioned at the start there. And then in the EDI survey, we've always given people the opportunity to describe their gender in different ways. So that includes non-binary or other, which 15 individuals have chosen. And there's also a large proportion that prefer not to say, which is why we found it useful to include both types on this particular graph. However, change is happening. So if we look at everybody on the register, some of those people have been on it for decades. But this slide here looks at those who are joining the register year on year, and you can see a changing trend there, which will hopefully in the future, as the profession moves on, as some people retire and new people continue to join, will hopefully lead to more representation, or rather a better reflection of society in terms of gender. So whilst the majority of new architects joining continue continue to be men, and that was at 51% in 2021. There is an increase in the proportion who are women. So in 2021, that was 47%. The trend has not been consistent. So you'll see in 2020, for example, there was a slight change and the proportion of men went up, but broadly over time, the increase has continued. We've also, in the report that's available today, and we're only going to present some of it because we've only got a short session and we've gone into a lot of detail in that report, but we've also in that report looked at UCAS data to try and understand how the profession could change in the future and students who are studying architecture. And that UCAS data shows that more women apply, receive offers and are accepted onto undergraduate courses to study architecture. So over 53% of applicants are now women, compared to just under 50 in 2016. And during the same period, acceptance rates have also increased. And this contrasts to the fact that 51% of qualifying architects who go on to join the register are male and 47% are female. So this tells us that women are dropping off along the way somewhere, but we don't know where. So we're hoping to address that as part of our education reforms, which you will be able to talk about in more detail later. We've also looked at age as well. So when we look at the age of new architects joining the register, we can see that more architects in the younger age bracket are women. So looking at all of the new registrants in, for example, 2021, 32% were women under the age of 30 and 29% were men under the age of 30. But when you look at the older architects joining the register, more of those who are aged 31 to 50 are male. So moving on to ethnicity, again, perhaps not a surprise here, white people are overrepresented on the register and most other ethnic groups are underrepresented. So the orange bars there show you architects and the blue bars show you figures from the most recent census. So this census was taken in 2021 and it is only just now being published. So this data was published in November of last year, which is why there's been a slight delay in terms of us doing our own analysis based on July 2022 and then being able to compare it to the national average. So you'll see here that all groups except for white people are underrepresented on the register and therefore in the architect's profession, most by roughly 1%. Black people are underrepresented by 3% compared to the national average. So unlike the regular statistics that we publish on our website, this report goes a stage further and it looks at intersectional data. So what you're looking at here is gender as well as ethnicity together. And we can't compare this to the overall census because that data hasn't been published yet. So white men comprise a third of the register and white women comprise a fifth. And with the exception of Asian and Asian British architects, all other ethnicities and genders comprise less than 1% of architects. However, again, when you look at new registrants who are joining every year, we can see a trend which will suggest that the register will be more reflective of society in the future. So in 2016, 83.9% of new registrants joining were white, and this dropped to 76.8% in 2021. Again, at the same time, you can see the architects who were Asian or Asian British and who were Black or Black British were increasing. So it's a modest increase there. If you look at Black and Black British architects, they went from 0.06, that should say, to 2.2% in 2021. So there is a slight increase, but it is over time, hopefully showing that new architects joining the register will better reflect the makeup of society. We've also looked at the architects who we engage with, so people who come to events such as the one you're attending today. We predominantly engage with architects, and given the data that I've just shared, this means that we don't speak to a group that reflects society, but we have tried to reach underrepresented voices. The figures here show respondents to our education survey from 2021, our CPD survey from 2021, and members of the Architects Engagement Group, which is ongoing, and many of you are members of that group. So because the education respondents we received were more diverse, so only 69% of respondents were architects and 31% came from other diverse groups, we can see that there's a slightly more representative selection there. But again, it's up to us to keep trying to engage and to extend the groups that we speak to and hear from as many different groups as we can. Moving on to location. So I mentioned that architects have to give us an address at which they are based as part of their role of joining the register. And over half, or rather half exactly, of all architects are based in London and the South East. And this is compared to 27% of the UK population. So this means that many of the regions of the UK are underrepresented. The second most common location is outside the UK, and then Scotland is the third most common. So all others are underrepresented. When we look, and again, this is in the detailed report that we've published, when we look at the changes from 2016 to 2021, the trend isn't getting any better. So over 60% of new registrants joining across each of those years were based in London and the South East. So I think this is a really good example of a major disparity that ARB can't influence. We don't set where the jobs are. We can't influence the market. It's not what a regulator does. But it is interesting for us to look at and try to understand what this means for the profession. And perhaps we can reflect on that a bit more under the questions. We also noticed that there's regional variation by ethnicity. So London in the southeast has 60% of architects based there, but when you look at specific ethnic groups, it's over 70% of Black and Black British architects on the register who are based there. It was also interesting to note that 1 in 4 Asian or Asian British architects are based outside of the country compared to 1 in 10 of all architects. So again, this is giving us quite an interesting picture of the profession, helping us understand what we can do to improve representation. So some of the questions that we ask on the EDI survey have slightly patchier data on them, and this is a good example of that. So we ask people what their sexual orientation is. 78% of architects identify as heterosexual, but 19% prefer not to say. So they will answer the question, but will give a prefer not to say answer. So when you exclude that group and you look at those who have told us their sexual orientation, 96% of those identify as heterosexual. And this is compared to a national estimate that 89% of the UK population are. So this gives us a strong indication that other sexual orientations are potentially underrepresented on the register. We've also noticed that architects' sexual orientation and whether they are comfortable sharing it varies significantly across different ethnic groups. So, for example, 84% of white architects are heterosexual and 13% prefer not to say, whereas 90% of Black or Black British architects are heterosexual and 8% prefer not to say. Again, this level of detail is in the report. So looking at religion, architects are less likely to be religious than the UK population at large. So 41% of architects are non-religious and 34% are Christian. And this compares to 48% of the UK population describing themselves as Christian and 37% saying they are not religious. The proportion of architects who say they are Christian increases with age. So you can see the dark blue columns increase as we go along towards older architects. And conversely, those who are non-religious decrease. So the orange bars slope down there. Across the entire register, 0.8% of architects are Buddhist, 33.9% are Christian, 0.8 Hindu, 0.5 Jewish, 1.3 Muslim, non-religious, again the bigger group, 40.6%. Other is 1.5%, prefer not to say is 20%, and Sikh is 0.4%. So this is one of the areas where we would like to improve our data. So there's a question that we ask on the Equality and Diversity survey about whether people have a disability, and only 1% of architects on the register answer yes, that they do. When you look at the data for England, it's over 17% who have a long-term physical or mental illness. So this indicates either that there's a huge disparity and that it's very uncommon to be an architect with a disability, or it could indicate that we're asking the wrong question. So at the moment, we're trialing a different question that better aligns with the census question in our education consultation, and we will review how people respond to that and whether it's an improvement that we can make to our equality, diversity and inclusion survey in the future. I will say at this point, we're really keen to hear from those with lived experiences or people who work with groups or are experts in this. So if you'd like to stay in touch with us. The communications email address that you can contact us at will be made available at the end of this webinar. Please do give us your advice. Please do help us get the question right so that we can collect that data on the Architects Register. And continuing that theme, this is another area where we think we might not be asking the right question. So we try to understand social mobility into the profession, and we ask a question that you can see on the screen there about whether or not people's parents had degrees when they were 14 years old. So 96% of the people who answer this question prefer not to say. And of those who do respond to it, there are very similar figures there. So it's not telling us much, and there aren't many trends that we can analyse there. So just to recap on what I've talked through so far, so we can see that the architect's profession does not reflect the makeup of society, although there are some shifting trends in the future. And then there are some areas where we'd like to improve our data and understanding. We'd like to better understand the gender and ethnic representation of those in initial education and training, to understand why and when certain groups fall away and don't go on to join the profession. We'd like to know why so few architects report that they have a disability compared to national trends, and whether this is something that's unique to the profession or whether we're asking the wrong sort of question. And we'd also like to know why some people prefer not to say, and how we can improve our data on certain characteristics such as sexual orientation and socioeconomic mobility. So Hugh, I'm going to hand back to you then. I'll keep the slides on because I think you'd like to tell people about the board's commitments to how we can try to change this.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I mean, there are a number of things that the slides are showing, but I'll talk in kind of more general terms. That essentially we've gone through all of our statutory functions and try to think, okay, what in each of those can we do to improve? And some of that's based on the evidence we've gathered around some of the challenges in our processes and systems. Some of it's based on feedback. So as this slide sort of talks about, it's the current review of education and training. And I think as the slide talks about, one of the things that we know we struggle with is understanding, and it relates to a question that someone's already posted in the chat box, which is, how do we track trends over time? So there are some really positive things, but what do we know about the attrition rate? What do we know about people leaving university? So so there are some things that we can do within our learning outcomes in relation to the commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion. But also, one of the things that we've heard pretty consistently is the variability in relation to support provided to students, and some of the challenges that students have, particularly those who are either from different ethnic groups or socioeconomic groups. So there are some enhanced standards for providers which we're currently consulting on. So some specific things within there. I think one of the other things that we haven't talked about so much in the report, but which we're reflecting on quite a lot, is the challenge that emerges in relation to the geographical lack of diversity, the fact that everything is drawn towards London and the Southeast. And one of the things that we've noticed, and I personally have noticed, is going around different parts of the UK and speaking to universities, is the challenge of finding high quality professional practical experience as part of initial education training, when all of the large practices are based in London, the Southeast. And this is not to say that you can't get good practical experience if you're working a smaller practice, absolutely not, but just the challenges of supply. And so is there something we need to think about there? So I think that's one of the important things that we're looking at. The other thing that is on the slide here is the review of the Architects Code of Conduct. And again, we'll be wanting to have a bit of a national conversation with the profession as well as the public about what are the current challenges within this sphere, and particularly what are the things that we might be able to do to strengthen, to be clear about our expectations as a regulator, but almost equally important, what the expectations the profession have of each other. So I think those are just two of the areas. I wanted to talk also about one of the sort of subsets around education and training, which is the prescribed examination, which again is another area where we find that there are challenges in relation to equality, diversity, inclusion. There is a major review that we've currently undertaking. There'll be more of that probably around September of this year. In terms of the survey and what we're currently doing, I think one of the things is recognizing that there are some things that we can do in terms of process. There are some bullet points on the slide here. We realize that the current registration process does not adequately reflect the need to give people options, particularly in relation to gender, and we're undergoing a major IT transformation program internally, which will enable us to far better capture data in that area. We realize there's a question on disability, which we can improve to better match the census data. I think, as Rebecca has alluded to, that while we've used the standardized question on social mobility, which is used as part of a generalized survey and census data, if very large proportion of architects are not responding to that, we know that we need to either reword that question or find a better way of encouraging people to respond. So lots of work ongoing, and again, we're committed to doing more in terms of analysing and publishing data, to capturing information through our consultations, to make sure that our policy development is informed by as wide a range of people as possible, both from the profession, more broadly from the public, and working with other organisations who maybe have a more direct role, for example, in relation to employers who we don't regulate, but also in the sense of the broader built environment. Next slide, Rebecca.
This is going to leave up to those details.
I've lost your audio, Rebecca. I don't know if it's just me.
Anyone else hear me, Terry?
I'm not sure. I've lost Rebecca on audio briefly. I'll just bring in Terry briefly to see if Terry has any other reflections, and maybe we'll take the slides down.
Yes, I mean, we do realize that there's areas where we could do better, where the all to those to assist. But when we look at something like disability, we know that there's visible and invisible disability, and sometimes people are not so comfortable sharing those elements, but we need to get to a place where the culture is one, that people feel confident that they're able to share that information, because it's only when there's adequate knowledge that employers and colleagues can make reasonable adjustments to assist them in the way they undertake their roles. And so we really want to get to a point where people are not declining to run, but feel that giving the response is going to help us all as a profession to move forward. So I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you, Terry. So we've lost Rebecca briefly, but I think it's probably worthwhile just going through some of the questions that we can see. I mean, I think the first question, which is from someone who's anonymous, has said, how do we decide what characteristics to track? And I guess the starting point is trying to make sure we're tracking characteristics which broadly reflect some of the census data, and the questions are trying to design so we can understand how we can compare to the population at large, because obviously that's one of the most powerful things to do, is to understand the extent to which the profession is underrepresented. However, so we also have the ability to add things within there if we can find a standardized form of words which would enable us to compare more broadly. And I think one of the questions which has popped up here, and I can see, and actually a number of people have asked, is really around neurodiversity, which I think is a really good question. And I think absolutely, I think someone has about 2 or 3 people have challenged us on that. And I think we'd absolutely want to understand that, you know, and personally, I'm no expert on how ONS and others capture the data, but I'm aware that some of that has traditionally been captured in relation to disability, but clearly neurodiversity is different from disability, and I think we'd want to think about that. So absolutely think that's a really good point, and we'd want to take that away and think about how we might be able to capture that, both in terms of how one defines neurodiversity, and again, there are various challenges around that, which I again would want to think about. But it's the broad principle. I think it's absolutely right. One of the
I'll just comment
go on, Terry.
On neurodiversity, because I do some EDI training, and I did come across some sort of statistics. It was to do with students, though, not people within the profession. So maybe if we're able to locate that sort of statistics coming forward on student coming into the profession, it may be something that we could use when we are reviewing people on the register. But it is a broad spectrum, neurodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely. Anonymous question: why do we think architects are reluctant to share information about economic status? I suppose the starting point is that actually I think one of the positive things, having worked with different professions, is that actually we've got a lot more data than some. So I think there is, the context is architects seem to be more happy than some professions to share data, and that's a really good thing. I think generally where people are reluctant to share data, it's either generally one of 2 things. Either they are suspicious about what we're going to use the data for, and is it genuinely anonymous? The other area, and I think this might be more relevant, is respondents not understanding why we need it. And I think there may be a communications thing there. So obviously, understanding economic status is obviously about diversity in its broadest sense and inclusion, and making sure that the profession is broadly reflective, and also recognizing that one of the major challenges that the profession has is around socioeconomic diversity. So I suspect that may be one of the reasons, but you know, again, we'll need to think more broadly about that. Just going through some of the other questions. What about collecting data on pass rates of gender race as part of the Part 3 examinations? I think there are two things that jump out there. One is I think we need to do better in terms of collecting data on the prescribed examination ourselves, and recognizing that we need to accept and acknowledge that there's work that we can do better there. But it's not just about pass rates, it's about accessibility more broadly. I think one of the things that we've said as part of a consultation on initial education and training is absolutely we need and we want to collect better, or ask providers for better data, and to make sure we're tracking that. So absolutely, that's one that I think will come back. There've been a couple of questions on gender. One is really about tracking over time, and I guess the more broader question, which is really around how do we manage and assess particularly women leaving the profession. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. One is we know from a kind of static analysis of the register that there are fewer women as you correlate to age. We haven't probably got the data as yet to track individuals and to work out, but that's probably something we can interrogate. And I think there's probably some of that in the report, but I do think absolutely we recognize that it's not simply a static thing that more women are entering the profession and are staying in equal numbers. We need to look at and make sure we're tracking to see the extent to which people are leaving the profession. Again, just looking through some of these questions. So Douglas asked, to what extent do the ARB find the overall strategy towards equality, diversity and inclusion align with REBA strategy? Do you have different responsibilities and or ability to affect change? So absolutely, we have different responsibilities in the sense that all of our activity is drawn back to our statutory functions. So absolutely, we can promote and share information, and we can look at each of our core functions, whether that be education and training, whether it be registration, whether it be standard setting or disciplinary functions, and to see what can we do to improve. But we don't regulate practices. And I think that's one of the sort of the key elements. REBA, we've been working very closely with and attended our EDA roundtable, which we held for organisations a couple of weeks ago. And so absolutely, we have a kind of joint working relationship, and I think we're planning to do more work on that, particularly looking to see whether we can compare and contrast our data, which is about individuals, and some of the data REBA may hold in relation to practice. So a really good question there. Again, Helen's flagged up that the REBA and UE report Why Women Leave Architecture demonstrates a lack of opportunities for progression, and a question, what can we do to address these? So I think some of that will come in with the code of conduct, but again, that's again related to the kind of a tracking question about glass ceilings, and again, that's something that I think we can work with REBA on. Terry, I don't know whether you wanted to come in on that, because I know you've had kind of a bit of work in that area.
Yeah. So I mean, I hope you can hear me. To
yep.
Move the dial, it's not just having the processes and things in place. It's really about behavior and changing our behavior, our mindsets, which is something that the code of conduct sets out to do. But having the code of conduct doesn't mean that people are automatically going to behave in that way. We need to have practices reviewing how they're doing in relation to that, and also having some kind of penalty for when people do not behave as they do, because not all cases will come up to ARB. And we've got to be able to police ourselves within our profession to ensure that our behavior matches what we're expected to do. And when we say we are, inclusive, we actually put that into practice and know what it means to be truly inclusive. Yeah.
Thanks, Terry. I'm quite conscious that we seem to be struggling slightly with technology, but just reading through the questions again, I think it's Sana, I hope I pronounced your name right, talking more broadly about how do we address the fact that many of the organisations in architecture and the built environment are led by dare I say, people who look and sound a bit like me, white and male, and how can we address this? And I guess there's a few things we can do as an organisation, and as Terry's alluded to, there are a few things others can and should do. I think one of the things is to thinking, what are the barriers that may exist that a professional regulator like us can address? And I think that first and foremost is definitely the kind of the education and training pathway and increasing diversity for those coming into the profession. I think, as Terry's pointed out, there is a sort of broader cultural professionalism thing, and I think that's harder to shift the dial, but one that I think it is really important for us to do, and to have conversations with the profession really about professionalism. And I think one of those things is it does link to behaviors, culture in the workplace, and a recognition that issues in relation to the culture of the workplace do directly relate to diversity. So absolutely a lot of work to do, and I think working collaboratively with some of the professional leadership bodies, including REBA, are absolutely have to be part of what we like to do. Rebecca, now you've returned. I think there's just one question which I think was asked, which maybe you might be in a better position to answer, but a question which was asked really around how do we and can we track for not just people joining the register, but the rates at which people leave, and particularly this issue around gender. But I think it doesn't just relate to gender. So what we can do in terms of understanding the makeup of the register and over time, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a great question, Hugh. Apologies, my computer went and then my Wi-Fi went, so hopefully this is going to work over my phone and 4G. Apologies if I leave again. So one thing that we do every year when we look at the register and those who have left it at the end of the previous retention fee period, we do some analysis to look at who has left, and we do split that down by age and gender. We haven't done that yet for this year, but we will be publishing that soon. But that's really on an annual basis, looking at who left and why, and it does tend to focus on people leaving at retirement age. That's always the biggest group. So that will have some trends in it, but I'm not sure it relates to the specific area of interest around, for example, women leaving and why they might leave.
Thanks, Rebecca. I've just got one other question here, which I'm sort of trying to scroll down and make sure I get to as many of them as possible. Is again, an anonymous question. How relevant is the comparison against UK census data if the second largest geolocation for those on the register are not UK based? It's a really good question. I mean, I guess in two parts. One, we're really interested to know why that is. But I think it's important to understand what the register is. It's a register of all those who are registered to practice, who are eligible to practice in the UK. So they may not be resident in, and their location may be outside. But ultimately, the practicing register is just that. So we know that there are plenty of people who are also who register who are temporarily abroad, and likewise there are people who continue with their registration despite having moved abroad. So I think there are a number of reasons why that might be. But again, I think it's important just to acknowledge that anyone who's registered has committed to the code of conduct, and it's essentially a kind of statement of intention to practice. So again, don't know if you want to add anything to that, Rebecca, but I think it is an interesting finding.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's only 1 in 10 people who are on the UK register who give us an address based in another country. So there is quite a low proportion. And we don't know whether that's a working address. It might be where their head office is and they would like communications to be sent there, or whether it's a home address. That's information that we don't have. So I think the analysis we've done is still useful. But yeah, perhaps in the future we could remove those 1 in 10 and then see if the figures are still similar.
Thanks, Rebecca. Oh, really good and challenging question again from Sana. Why don't you make people do unconscious bias tests? Oh, so, and I guess the first question I'm not sure is which people you refer to, but I guess there's a couple of things. One is it relates to internally. So the board has done a training on unconscious bias, and we have within our business plan equality, diversity, and inclusion training, not just for staff and board members, but for all of our associates, people who do the prescribed examination, people who visit universities. So again, making sure people are aware of biases, I guess, is a broader philosophical question and practical question, which we've been discussing with some of the engagement groups and working groups, is around unconscious biases. So we all have unconscious biases, and when we know those biases, the question is, how do we mitigate the risk of those biases affecting our decisions? And so so I think there's an interesting question there about not just ensuring that people are trained, and those that we work with directly are trained in unconscious bias, but what practical action are we doing to mitigate the risks around that? So, for example, internally, things that we might do around employment and anonymizing identify features that may be a risk factor in terms of recruitment, but there are kind of wider issues in relation to our requirements, particularly for education and training providers in relation to equality, diversity, and ensuring. And again, I'd encourage anyone who hasn't looked at it again to look at the draft requirements on learning providers in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion. Terry, I don't know whether you wanted to come on, because again, you've got some expertise around unconscious bias and unconscious bias training, whether you wanted to talk a little bit more about training development and requirements.
So, I mean, it's something which should be part of the CPD that, practices organize. And I know that certainly I've delivered that within certain practices. We need to review when we're thinking about our CPD commitments, that it's not just the technical elements that are being covered. It's important that the people element of delivering design are also covered. And EDI is not just something in relation to those who you work with. It also relates to the clients that you are working with. It relates to the other consultants in whom you're working together as a team with. And I know that some bigger employers are now asking for evidence of having a strategy and maybe what you actually do in the training. But that's really for the much larger projects. On the smaller projects, that's not the norm. So it's just for individuals and practices to really think about what's important training for them to have. And for those who have signed up to the sort of corporate requirements of the RIBA, there is certainly requirements there. But ARB are not sort of setting out the criteria of what has to be covered in training. So we expect that people can review their context and circumstances and have that. But I think it's training which everyone should have, and not just in practice, probably in architectural school as well. We start to learn all about this and not wait till we get into practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Rebecca, there's just a couple of questions which I think would be being raised in advance, which we might just touch on as well. Will we be able to break down our data in terms of different size of practice and members of staff from different levels, from junior to senior? I mean, I could have. The answer to that I think I know, but I think you might be able to articulate it better. I'm happy to pick it up if you want.
Sounds like a challenge. I doubt I will. If we don't collect that is the simple answer. So what we have done previously, we've tried to look at practice sizes and other data that others have published and look at people who tell us what practice they work at and correlate things that way. But that's not reliable because people don't have to tell us that, and they might be using a home address instead. So the simple answer is we don't collect people's places of work, and we certainly don't collect their job level or what their job title is, nor do we compare that and what that means in terms of hierarchies at different practices. So that's not something we're able to do.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the statistical side of it, that it's problematic, although as Rebecca says, we do, we can identify a sort of broad proxy, so we'd be able to see some things, but it wouldn't be reliable data. But I do think there's an important role for qualitative data and qualitative research, and I think one of the things we've done through the various engagement groups is understand some of the practical issues that people find within practices, and absolutely aware and of the glass ceiling issue that people have raised with us in relation to both gender and ethnicity. And I think, again, as a couple of comments been made on the chat box, one only needs to look at the senior levels within the profession to understand that the data we publish today and showing the disparities within some of the groups are reflected within senior people within the profession as well. So, absolutely, we kind of acknowledge that there is more we can do. Won't always be through quantitative data and the collection of data if we don't have a statutory role, and it's hard to collect or it's unreliable. But there is definitely more that we can do in terms of broader research. I think I'm
okay. Just to say
on,
that
Terry.
Hugh, I'll just come in quickly. Just to say that there is some published data there on the top 100 practices in the country, which covers diversity of staff. So for anyone who's looking for that type of information, that's a starting point. But unfortunately, that's just the top 100 practices. And we know that the architects are much smaller practices, and that's where there's a gap in the information. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think we've come towards the end of the question, so it might be a good time to wrap up and just keep a close eye to check I haven't missed anyone. I'm going to get one of the sort of final questions on my list is from an anonymous who said, "Well, great start. What next?" So, firstly, thanks. I hope, as a minimum, what we've shown today is that we're willing to put time, effort, and resource into data and data collection, not only so that we can understand what we need to do better, but we also can shine a spotlight on other areas that need to be addressed. Practically, I think I've kind of outlined some of the things that we're doing at the moment in terms of what next. So some of those are enhancing some of the data collection that we're doing through, or hoping to do through, the initial education training review to understand better what's coming into the profession. I think some of those is promoting and enhancing and making stronger some of the standards and requirements that we place on those we regulate. So again, that's looking at ensuring that all students coming out of additional education training have got a much broader understanding in relation to equality, diversity, inclusion, and that the providers who are providing that education training, universities, schools of architecture, are held to account for some of those issues as well. We've also got the code of conduct review, which again is another opportunity to push some of these sorts of things. And Rebecca's team will be looking more broadly about some of the feedback and thinking about how do we enhance some of the data collection, and looking at some of the really good questions that have been raised today, not least this issue around neurodiversity and how do we understand better what the issues in relation to neurodiversity are, both the positive opportunities that neurodiversity and those who have are neurodiverse provide, but also thinking about definitions, trends, issues, experiences, which again will come potentially from a mix of quant and qual data. I think, as you might have seen on the chat, the team will remind you that if you have got any further questions, do email communications@arb.uk, and there's an opportunity to join our engagement group. And again, that's accessible through the website. I'm just going to pause briefly just to check with first Terry and then Rebecca whether there's anything you feel that I've missed that we need to add. Terry?
No, I think you've covered it all, and we recognize that this is the start of the journey, and it's a journey where things are constantly changing. So we know that you never quite arrive. We just keep going and improving what we do and what we can achieve, working alongside others. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Rebecca?
Yeah, so there's a risk you've already covered this, Hugh, whilst I was traveling around trying to find Wi-Fi connection. But one thing it'd be really great if people could do would be to respond to our education consultation. So Hugh, you've mentioned the fact that some of the standards that we're setting for learning providers and the competencies that we want future architects to be able to demonstrate have been developed to look at equality, diversity and inclusion in the profession, to encourage people to advocate for it, to encourage respect between people. That consultation closes on the 10th of May, so there's an opportunity to read the draft competencies that your fellow professionals should demonstrate in the future and tell us whether we've got them right. I think that would be really valuable from this group who are interested in EDI.
Fabulous. Thanks, Rebecca. And then finally, again, a reminder, if you feel as though we've missed your question, do email communications@arb and we will try and get round to it. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating today. The link, again, was shared in relation to seeing the report in more detail. Again, hope you feel as though it's been a useful contribution, a useful hour of your time, but we certainly appreciate it and really appreciate all the really helpful and at times challenging questions. Really important that you feel as though you can hold us to account. Thank you all and have a very good Wednesday.